just something. It's wonderful, and I'm really sorry I couldn't attend your lectures next week. Because I have a conflict. Thank you so much, but we are leaving. Let's take a look. We are leaving tomorrow night. Testing 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Good morning. We have a small announcement here first from a fellow lecturer. Please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Handley, and tomorrow morning in this lecture theatre I'm going to be delivering my double lecture, what they call a course, on the musical highlights of Eastern Europe. And my daughter can't take my complimentary ticket because she's gone hiking with some friends. So would anybody like Catherine's complimentary ticket for the highlights, musical highlights of Eastern Europe tomorrow morning? Okay, there we go. And I hope you've signed up for my Beethoven course next week. 250 years, 1770 to 2020. See you there.
Thank you.
Just that? Okay.
So we can dim the light. Testing 1, 2, 3. You can hear me well? Maybe this is too dark, or is it okay? Too dark, because people... No? Oh, they want the light lower. Lower the light? This is good enough? This is good. Perfect. Okay, and you can hear me well? I want to make sure that we do not have interference if the mic is too strong. So something when I move happens, but hopefully it will be fine. Okay, there we go. I'm just testing with walking because sometimes you can have most unpleasant sounds, as you know. So, good morning again. This is the 5th lecture, and of course, I had to conclude with self-portraits because, as I mentioned already at the beginning of the course, Rembrandt is probably the artist who left us the largest number of self-portraits, at least among old masters, if not among all artists, but I cannot really claim that anymore in 21st century. However, of all of the old masters, this is the largest number of self-portraits that we have by anyone. And that in itself is quite remarkable. Somebody was asking me the other day about how many paintings he painted. There is no precise number. How many paintings he painted? Probably more than those that exist today, that's for sure. Paintings did get destroyed. How many drawings he made? Of course, we cannot know either. But what survives is also very much a subject of debate in terms of authorship. As you may remember, I mentioned that there was a Rembrandt research project in Amsterdam for 3 decades. A whole team of art historians were trying to establish the exact number of paintings painted by Rembrandt. And initially, there were generous estimates going back to beginning of 20th century of about 600 plus paintings. Well, now that number has dropped to probably around 350. But I'm saying probably, because there are still works in private collections that the collectors call Rembrandt that have not been sufficiently studied. There hasn't been technical analysis, X-rays, analysis of pigments, panels, etc., to figure out if they are Rembrandts or not. And there are even works in major museums where museum feels it's a Rembrandt, but other scholars may disagree. 10 years ago, approximately, National Gallery of Art had an exhibition, a beautiful exhibition called Late Rembrandt Portraits of Apostles and Christ, because in the last decade of his life, he also painted a series of apostles. But in a very Protestant way, they look like real people sitting in their rooms rather than Catholic apostles. that Rubens might paint. And even then, with the National Gallery show, which was curated by one of the Rembrandt experts in the world, actually, who happens to be my dissertation advisor, Dr. Arthur Wheelock, who is one of the foremost experts on Rembrandt in the world, recognized as such by the Dutch, and also actually knighted by the Dutch, my former professor. And I went at one point to the Belgian embassy in Washington, where he received his knighthood from the Belgians too, for his contributions to the study of Dutch and Flemish art in America. So he's now retired as of last year from the National Gallery, but he was a great, great mentor. And of course, he was also a great curator who contributed a lot to the collection at the National Gallery. So Arthur Wheelock, who curated that exhibition of the Apostle portraits, had this show, this installation, and even then, I could hear people walking around, other curators, debating amongst themselves. No, this is a follower. No, this is Rembrandt and studio. No, there is another hand in here. So truly, I don't have an answer how many paintings he painted. Several hundred. Same thing applies to etchings. There, it's not so much a matter of attribution, because they're mostly signed and dated and exist in multiples, so we can say they're Rembrandt. But the big problem is drawings. In that medium, there are plenty of drawings that are open to debate. Because even though I showed you very few drawings, and they're pen and ink and very sketchy in his approach, very open, very free, very quick, actually, there were other people who emulated Rembrandt's style. So I have seen drawings in the collection of the National Gallery, again, because that's where I live. And you can go and you can ask to look at objects from the collection. And the curators there do not know. Well, somebody thinks this is a Rembrandt drawing, other people disagree. So art history is far from settled in terms of these opinions about the attribution of Rembrandt's works. I'm showing you here, as a first image, this self-portrait that we will go to from around 1640. It's a marvelous self-portrait. It's probably Rembrandt at his most handsome. He really made himself good-looking here, smoothed out any imperfections, refined his features. I'm just giving you a close-up of the face. There is a sense of almost nobility in this face. He looks like an educated young man, somebody very fine, fine manners. Look at that nice collar that you can glimpse. And of course, nice mustache and a little bit of beard, but he looks very, very proper. And furthermore, the refinement that you can feel in this face is reflected in the handling. I've talked a lot about rough style and smooth style and how Rembrandt alternates between the two, but I want to underscore one more thing, that artists intuitively felt that when something is a noble subject, it needs to be treated in a smooth style. More elevated subject deserves smoother, finer handling. Whereas if you're painting pictures of little peasants in an inn, for example, you don't make it in a fine style. You make it in a very sketchy, impressionistic, rough, quick manner. That subject deserves that kind of handling. So there is a whole idea of decorum, how you represent certain subjects, almost the way actors speak on stage. But then artists play with these rules of decorum endlessly. Frans Hals, famously a contemporary of Rembrandt, older contemporary from Haarlem, painted mostly in rough style, but painted all of these very distinguished people, including René Descartes, when he was living in Holland. So the general rule is that nice and fine, smooth style is reserved for finer subject, rough one for rougher subject. But of course, there are plenty of opportunities for artists to twist these rules and to reinterpret them as they see fit. This is an example of a fine style applied to a fine self-portrait, which elevates him. So, as we go through these self-portraits today, I would like to mention again that my big theme is the self-portrait as a diary. And when I talk about this business of diary, I want to underscore the fact that until fairly recently, art historians were rather reluctant, or I would say some art historians working in this field were rather reluctant to give these people from the 17th century a kind of perspective that recognizes their own sense of privacy and individuality. People used to say, I'm not going to say all of them used to say, but many art historians felt, and social historians, cultural historians, that 17th century people didn't have the same kind of idea of subjectivity, I versus the world, I in the world, that is associated with the modern men and women. That has been revised slowly, little by little. But I can mention an example of a colleague of mine, an older colleague of mine also, who has been, in a sense, also a mentor, Perry Chapman. She wrote a beautiful book about Rembrandt's self-portraits back in 1989. And Perry Chapman there explored this whole idea of Rembrandt's self-representation, self-fashioning, how he actually consciously created a persona, how he constantly changed, sometimes because of the market, sometimes because of subjective reasons. And Perry Chapman was criticized by some of the more conservative art historians for ascribing to Rembrandt a kind of subjectivity, sense of individuality, personhood that 17th century people would not have. It has changed since, but I have spoken to her about this, and she felt that there were too many art historians at that time who were very conservative and said, no, 17th century people did not think of themselves in such pronounced fashion as individuals. Yes, of course, but then you look at Shakespeare, right? And all of the individuals in Shakespeare, John Donne, just to mention English literature examples. Or you look at Michel de Montaigne, the great essayist from the end of the 16th century France. And indeed, I know people have mentioned Montaigne more recently vis-a-vis Rembrandt, but as you know, he's probably the first author of what we call essays in literature. His collection of essays or writings on different subjects. And in the preface to the book, or the address to the reader, he famously states, and I'm paraphrasing this, of course, that I myself am the subject of my book. I myself am the subject of my book. Whatever I say here about any number of topics, from how to love your country to how to raise your children, it all comes from my consciousness, my awareness, my impressions, my subjectivity. So already Montaigne, at the end of the 16th century, says that anything you write is essentially an autobiography. Which is why I think that this man, who left us so many self-portraits, was intensely autobiographical person in everything he did. There is always a kind of Rembrandt there, or Rembrandt's eye, Rembrandt's view, which we also saw comically in The Night Watch. So, Rembrandt left us, as I said, 50 to 60 self-portraits, and they're very strange at times. And a case in point is this one, an early one, 1629, before he moves to Amsterdam. And if you were looking at that nice-looking guy up until now on the screen, you might say, what's going on here? And what is going on here in this very chiaroscuro self-portrait with open mouth is Rembrandt, the student of character and emotion. We already talked about the idea that Rembrandt was not just about capturing likeness, how we appear, but he was far more interested in how we feel. So if that is not subjective, what is? how we feel when, now, under certain circumstances. And not only how we feel, but also how do we become visible? How do we become perceived by the world? Not only what we express from us, but what others can see from us, once more because of light or absence of light, physically speaking. Of course, he's relatively poor at this point as an artist, or doesn't have that much money to spend on models. So many people have said that in the late 1620s, when he paints a number of self-portraits, it is motivated first by the fact that he is his most readily available model in the studio. Secondly, by the fact that he's learning about expressions and he tries to test that knowledge. Thirdly, by the fact that he's trying to already represent himself to the world or fashion himself as a master of human emotions. And what's a better way of showing that than by showing the same face, meaning the Rembrandt face, 10, 20 times, displaying a whole range of emotions. So what you will notice is that oftentimes he'll be wearing this felt cap. Now that felt cap, that soft felt cap, but also he's wearing here a georgette, that kind of metal breastplate, which has automatically some kind of nobility suggestion and a nice scarf around his neck, but there is this black felt cap. And that black felt cap would have been, in a certain way in 17th century, associated with the artist's profession, like the beret in France in 19th century. But artists in the studio wouldn't be working necessarily with the black felt cap painting because it could get very easily dirty and it was expensive. Typically in the studio they would wear some kind of a white painter's cap, or they would just wrap their heads with white cloth, with something simple, linen, some raw linen, in order not to mess their hair up and not to interfere with the process of painting, meaning their hair not to get into the painting. At any rate, I'm mentioning the black cap because you saw that little black cap in the Night Watch, and you will see it a couple of times today as his regular attire. And actually that colleague of mine, Perry Chapman, who wrote the book about Rembrandt's self-portraits in '89, she used a particularly funny cartoon that I think she sourced from the New Yorker at the first page when you open the book. On the cover, there is a serious portrait of Rembrandt, but then you open the book and there is this cartoon from New Yorker, and there is this guy standing and an easel is in front of him, and he says, "Henrike, Henrike, bring the black cap. I feel a painting coming." So yes, the black cap is something that people recognize as the painter's modality, right? At any rate, you also find him like this rather strange and not terribly attractive self-portrait, which is currently at the Getty Museum. Getty acquired this in 2013 for $25 million, which is, pittance in today's world, when you consider Leonardo's Salvator Mundi, 450 million. But this is a very, very small oil-on panel, 22 by 17 centimeters, like a page from a book, just to remember. And also, it's not a terribly attractive picture, right? Getty Museum has a lot of money, but they came into the game of buying art fairly late vis-a-vis other American museums. And the old master market, you do not have that many masterpieces floating around anymore freely to be purchased. So when they show up, those in the top tier fetch, very, very high prices. But in this particular case, I find this self-portrait rather crude. And once more, I know he's experimenting. I know he's doing all these emotion studies, but there are all kinds of bits and pieces about this self-portrait that make me wonder. I'm not going to say this is, not Rembrandt, but somebody one day may decide that the Getty bought something which is not 100% Rembrandt, but then who could it be in 1629? He did not have a studio full of assistants then, so maybe it's a slightly more awkward or less fully resolved self-portrait. I just find it not entirely convincing somehow in its handling. And insofar as the so-called unattractive face, well, Rembrandt is not afraid of showing the range of faces that he has because of certain emotions, grimaces even. And Rembrandt, and this is something that this interest in laughter, for example, probably relates to Frans Hals, the Haarlem painter, who painted so many images that highlight that notion of the ephemeral moment, the laughter, laughing cavalier, laughing children, musicians, etc. So it is part of that milieu in 17th century Holland. So very dramatic expression of emotion. Once again, that metal georgette, the breastplate, that signifies something slightly upper class. So there is a purposeful dissonance between the not so refined face and a piece of attire or an attribute that he wears which identifies him as higher class. Let me just show you the full image again. Oh, sorry. Here we go. And you can see what is also unusual here is how plain and white that background is. Maybe that makes me think that I don't quite like it, because in Rembrandt's case, most of the people will be coming from darker backgrounds. I'm not going to say 100% of the time, but for the most part, people come out from these backgrounds, from the shadows. So let me just move on and show you this one, self-portrait with Georgette. He painted himself a number of times with this metal breastplate around 1629. But look at the difference here. It's a lovely, lovely, also very small oil-on panel. He starts out by this series of small oil-on panel self-portraits. And this is essentially the serious or even melancholy equivalent of the laughing guy that we just saw. Because you can see the same length of hair, right? You can see the same Georgette again. It is the same face. I also think that the pose here is very awkward, that arm akimbo doesn't quite look right. But he's still a student, so to speak, even though he's working as an independent artist. And he's still learning how to position figures in space. So he feels more comfortable with bust-length forms, such as this one. And then look at this. 1629 in Nuremberg, and the one you see on the right is 1629 approximately from Mauritshuis in The Hague, the Royal Collection. Which one do we like more? The left one or the right one? The left one, some people say. Some other people might say the right one. Both of them were said to be by Rembrandt until fairly recently. The right one now, from the Mauritshuis, is said to be by somebody else. It's a very good portrait. No question about it. So this is just an example of how iffy the attribution can be. And why do people think that this is not Rembrandt? It just feels too refined all around and smooth and almost too idealized. I do not know where I stand on this. I still like it. I still think it's perfectly acceptable as Rembrandt. But now they call it Rembrandt Studio or an artist painting Rembrandt. Who could that artist be? The only ones that come to mind, well, the only one that comes to mind would be Jan Lievens, with whom they shared studio in Leiden around 1629, the guy with whom they competed with the raising of Lazarus, which I showed you early on in the course. Jan Levens, who becomes a very good portrait painter. He too is a youngster at this point, and maybe he says, okay, Rembrandt, now I'm going to paint you. Or maybe, since it is so close to the Nuremberg self-portrait, which is firmly attributed to Rembrandt, maybe this is Gerrit Douw, another of his contemporaries with whom he shared studio, who becomes then best known for his exquisitely smooth and fine manner. Either way, this is one example, just one example of how complicated the question of authorship can be. This one, incidentally, the one from the Mauritshuis, also has a lighter background, like the funny one from the Getty, but completely different, as you can tell. So, I already showed you this etching yesterday, and you see the black cap. Now you will notice it whenever it appears, that felt cap. And he does look very artistic in here. And of course, in the etchings, he always signs and dates. Always, or most of the time, let's say. There are still a couple of exceptions, but he signs and dates a lot of them. And then, when he wants just to create expressive heads, such as this one, he may leave them unsigned. In this particular case, I believe there is no signature and no date. And of course, once more, you have him creating a face for us, for the audience, making a face at us, as an expression of the 17th century interest in moti di anime, meaning the movements of the mind or the movements of the soul. And this is something that is not just present in Holland. In Italy, of course, they're very concerned with the notion of motions of the mind. In France, Lebrun, one of the founders of the French Academy, he will be writing and he will create a whole book with studies of human faces and expressions. So this is a pan-European phenomenon, the interest in expression. But there is nobody else, I can tell you that, who uses himself in such drastic manner to create near caricatures. Leonardo already began making caricatures of faces. But Leonardo, the gorgeous youth as he was, although we don't know what he looked like, would have never made himself look ugly purposefully. I'm positive. Because when you show that kind of a face, that face also is supposed to express a very unpleasant emotion, or perhaps even an unpleasant character trait. Why would you want to do that to yourself? At any rate, Rembrandt is willing to go there. So he creates a whole range of these images. Sometimes he is a king, of course. So Rembrandt can be a beggar, Rembrandt can be a king, Rembrandt can be anything. He is a master of disguise. He is, and this is 1634, he signs and dates it. And there he is extremely regal, looking with this sword. And you will see that he loves this notion of transgressing boundaries. How do I go from high and low again? And where do I actually am socially? Where do I am as a person? Where am I? Where am I? Where am I as a person or socially? So all this self-exploration becomes truly a subject of an entire body of work that starts from the 1620s and concludes, or doesn't conclude ever, by the time of his death in 1669. Look at that. What is this all about? I showed you the studies of the female head, Saskia, notably, from the 1630s. And there, at least, you had 4 or 5 different faces on the etching. Here you have good old Rembrandt in shadow. His biggish bulbous nose appears even more prominent here, like he hasn't slept well or drank too much last night or something. But where is Rembrandt? In what context do we find him? With these other studies, here is a head horizontally. You can see another older head of a woman, but they look like people you would encounter in the street. Lower class, I wouldn't call them beggars, but poorer people in Holland walking in the streets that you can find on the market. Why is he doing this? Well, because just like with the heads of Saskia that we saw yesterday, I believe that for him it is also very, very important to convey to the audience that every work of art is a process of constant thinking and rethinking. You know, in Renaissance drawings, you would have presentation drawing, which is fully finished, something that you give to a patron to show him what you can do before you paint the picture. Then you have straightforward preparatory drawings, a sketch for a painting. Then you also have something that they called pensieri, or thought drawings, quick thoughts, thought processes. And this is a kind of pensiero, as if he were going around with a notebook, drawing, and here you have Rembrandt's face, and then the beggars or the poor people next to him. So there are all kinds of interesting questions that an image like this raises, but he certainly doesn't give us answers. We already saw versions of Rembrandt and Saskia, notably the one where he portrayed himself as the prodigal son in the inn, where he held her on his lap. But in this particular case, 1636, so 10 centimeters, fairly small. They're tiny. Many of these etchings, especially the ones on this private subject, are very, very small. That in itself adds to the notion of privacy. Sort of little glimpses into a life, rather than the 3 crosses, the 3 trees. So here, the muse, and there he is drawing his muse, or making the silver point portrait, you remember, of Saskia from 1633, with a little arch above. But this is 1636. And here he's wearing a wide-brimmed hat with a feather. And I should have brought you back a portrait of Saskia with the wide-brimmed hat and feather. But he portrayed her with the same hat. So who cares, male hat, female hat? It makes for an interesting appearance. That's what counts. So this is probably the same hat that Saskia wears in one of the portraits. But there he is much larger than her, and she's kind of distant, sitting in the chair. In order to convey that notion of observation, he turns towards us and tells us, this is who I paint. She is the beginning of all of my work. And if this is supposed to be the artist and his muse, they're certainly very humble looking, both of them. There is, again, absolutely no sense of idealization of her features. Like, why would she be somebody's muse? Because she is his Saskia. That's all that counts. And therefore, she is his muse. So that leads me to the self-portrait that I just showed you at the beginning of the class. And 1640, National Gallery in London, signed and dated 1640. It's one of the most splendid self-portraits of Rembrandt. And truly, I mean, you have the black cap, very fancy velvet one. You also have fur-lined jacket. This is 2 years before he paints the Night Watch. This is when he's already arrived in Amsterdam, so to speak, as a major artist. And of course, the way in which his arm rests on that parapet, on that boundary, also is full of authority. Sense of authority, comfort, confidence, beauty. This is a very proper portrait. Plus, it is arched on top, which gives it an added value somehow. It would have been framed with an oval frame. I'm just going to show you another image of this, where you can see it somewhat lighter, just because of slides and how they can differently project. And I wanted you to see that on this reproduction, you can see the signature more clearly, and you can see all of the features. This gorgeous sleeve, for example, that he paints. The cloak, look at that cloak. all of this is very noble looking, right? Including the face. And what's interesting is that, as art historians have long argued, this portrait is based or reinterprets famous precedents. One famous precedent is The Man with the Blue Sleeve by Titian from around 1515. Right? How Titian? He never went to Italy. Because Titian was so famous at this time that many of his paintings did travel throughout Europe, meaning from one prominent collection to another. And Rembrandt, we know, was very interested in Italian art, even though he didn't want to admit it, and he knew a lot about it, because there were many prominent Amsterdam collectors who did have great works of art by Italian masters. And a well-known artist could have access to such a collection to study them. And it is quite agreed among art historians that Titian and Titian's painterly style was an important influence on Rembrandt, even though The Man with the Blue Sleeve is early Titian, 1515, so not exactly example of Titian's painterly style and his tendency towards dark colors and red and black, which is characteristic of Titian after about 1550. But at this moment, this portrait was known as Ariosto. Ariosto being one great 16th century poet from Italy. People don't know who the Man with the Blue Sleeve is, but in the 17th century he was known Titian's Ariosto. And it is not insignificant that Rembrandt uses Titian's Ariosto, not only because of the idea of confidence, nobility, inherent nobility in this person, but also because Rembrandt compares himself to a famous Italian poet by using this portrait as a model. And of course, at this time, one of the guiding principles in art theory is ut pictura poesis, which means as in poetry, so in painting. Painters are poets, or painters aspire to be like poets, because poetry was always seen as superior to the art of painting, since poetry can disclose the movements of the soul more effectively than a work of art, visual work of art. So Rembrandt is very consciously saying, I am like Titian's Ariosto. But secondly, he's also looking at another very famous portrait by Raphael. This is the portrait of Baldassare Castiglione. And Castiglione was a friend of Raphael in Rome who wrote a very, very, very popular book, which was known as the Book of the Courtier. That book became a bestseller in Europe, especially in court settings, translated into many languages, and it was essentially a primer on how to become an elegant gentleman when you grow up. The Book of the Courtier. And the book insisted on many, many different little rules about proper gentlemen. Some of them are, you have to be well dressed, but not in a show-offish fashion. You can wear some expensive items, but do not disclose that you paid a lot of money. It has to have a certain air of nonchalance about it, right? You can imagine. Subdued elegance, all of these ideas. When you talk, you shouldn't be too demonstrative. You should be refined and restrained and hold your hands like this, right? Not like me when I lecture, but there is Baldassare Castiglione's portrait. This is how Raphael, who for Baldassare Castiglione exemplified the notion of gentleman painter, this is how Raphael, his friend, portrays Baldassare Castiglione himself as the epitome or the embodiment of the gentleman that he writes about, with those folded hands, with the big luxurious sleeve, but not too show-offy, with a sense of what we say, quiet self-confidence, and with that nice big felt cap, which is not a painter's cap in 16th century Italy. But people say that Rembrandt, when he portrayed himself in 1640, was picking up both on Titian's Man in the Blue Sleeve and on Balthazar Castiglione's book of the courtier, as well as the portrait by Raphael. How did he know Castiglione? How did he know this particular portrait? We do know that for a fact, that in 1639, he went to one of the art auctions in Amsterdam, a sale of somebody's private collection, and at that auction, one of the items for sale was Raphael's portrait of Castiglione. He was so impressed that he made a drawing, and he wrote, I saw this at the auction in 1639 on such and such date, and it was the most expensive of all of the pictures in the auction. It fetched 3,500 guilders. He was very impressed by the high price that people paid for this Italian painting. And you can see that when he made the sketch after Balthazar Castiglione's portrait, right, he already kind of put himself in there. It's very funny how already in recording the painting that he saw at the auction, he inserts, even though the guy has beard and the sketch has beard, I can see there in the nose and the eyes already a bit of Rembrandt. And of course, lo and behold, in addition to painting himself in 1640 as Castiglione, he also made an etching of himself as Castiglione. So, is it believable that he modeled himself after famous Italians? Yes. And he wanted to show that he doesn't need to go to Rome in order to become as good as the Italians. He can stay in Holland and be like Raphael, and like Titian, and like the gentleman Castiglione. And here is once more in this beautiful etching, that huge sleeve, gloves, and that soft cap, and the fur-lined jacket. So this is Rembrandt at his most confident, 1640, 1642. Here is another self-portrait from that period, again with the feather added to the cap. Just the close-up that I showed you at the beginning, and this one too. It was at this time that he became also very well off and owned a very big house, Rembrandt's house, which is now, it has this addition, the museum, right? This is the Rembrandt's house itself, and look what they feature on the poster, of course, one of these very regal-looking self-portraits, the etching from 1640. But it was at this time that he made quite a bit of money, and that he made a house that also had a private collection of art. It was a very proper patrician-looking house with busts, of course, like most proper houses would have. And of course, with a studio, and this is a reconstruction, a view of what his studio would have looked like. And what's interesting is that while most artists would have in their studios busts to study, to learn from, he also had all these other tchotchkes, naturalia, meaning natural wonders, shells, minerals, butterflies. This is not the exact, look, Chinese bowls, not exactly the same specimens that he had in 17th century, but based on what we know about the inventory of his collection when he went bankrupt in 1656, these are the kinds of items that he did own. So Rembrandt was voracious in terms of his interests. We do not have inventory of his books, complete inventory, but he did own books and read. He just never wanted to present that so obviously to the world. But he also had antique busts that were both for studying purposes and also to show his learning. And yet, at the same time, when he makes that self-portrait, 1639, the etched self-portrait as the gentleman painter par excellence, he also makes this very, very strange artist drawing a model in 1639, which is, by the way, one of those most perplexing infinite or non finito etchings. It is not a drawing, it is not a sketch, it's a multiple, it's a print. The only idea that comes to mind when you look at this very roughly sketched figure of the artist, even more roughly sketched muse, and compare them, look at, that's the painting on the easel, by the way, the blank canvas. You remember that blank canvas from the early self-portrait? And compare all of that to this dark area where you see this super finished and refined bust on a pedestal. The only thing that comes to mind in terms of interpretation is the long path between the process or the work in the studio and the artistic ideal of the finished work of art that you aspire to. The work of art that you aspire to is this thing on the pedestal with the palm. Palm meaning symbol of triumph, the palm of glory, laurel, palm, both of them can signify that. And look how that palm begins from the studio and becomes more finished as it goes towards the realm of art, or what is complete and what you're happy with. But this is where you are. The messiness of that studio work with lots of uncertainty, correction, imperfection, unfinished work. And this is something that keeps happening in Rembrandt. The dissonance, the disconnect between the aspiration and the reality of what you do, how you work. So here is just another very rough drawing from that time period. Why in the world would anybody draw a muse like this? This is clearly connected to the etching, clearly connected to the etching. And then, just to show you, this is his satire on art criticism. Because even though he's this fancy guy around 1640 and paints the Night Watch, this is pen and brown ink. It's in the Lehman collection in New York. What you have is, this is the patron of the art, the one who buys works. And he has ass's ears, like King Midas from antiquity, who was the famously bad judge of art in the competition of Apollo and Pan. And here is I assume the artist, or I assume this is the artist who is defecating and wiping his behind with a piece of paper while presenting the painting to the patron. Vulgar, perhaps, yes. But Rembrandt was a rebel. And Rembrandt in this drawing says, oh, well, to hell with these people who have all the money and buy our paintings. What do they know? What do they know? So this is just that Rembrandt at his defiant, humorous, and vulgar, so to speak. But he can also be very, very serious. This is a self-portrait from 1648. And in this self-portrait, this is this wonderfully somber, serious, concentrated, focused, and very well finished in comparison to what we've been looking at so far. And here, he signed and dated himself on the tiny little curtain over the window, like the artist is almost curtain master in theater, somebody who makes it happen or doesn't make it happen. And looking at us, and what I find fascinating is that he seems to be drawing rather than painting. Or even more, I could say he seems to be writing. The painter as a writer, just like we said, painter as a poet. I will skip over this one. I want to go to some of the late self-portraits. This is a rather self-confident self-portrait, but very humble colors. Look at the difference between this and the patrician self-portrait of 1642. And this is Rembrandt with arms akimbo, probably, 1615 preparation for the painted one. And as he ages, he becomes ever more reflexive, ever more self-reflective, like looking at us, quiet, no longer demonstrating gentlemanly demeanor or appearance, very faithful to his own look as it changes over time, and rather somber. This is a year before his bankruptcy. This is also at the time when he paints this very beautiful portrait of his son Titus. He painted his son Titus around this time on a number of occasions. This poor kid would die at age 18. So there was only one surviving daughter at the time of his death. And Titus was trained to be an artist by his own father. And Rembrandt had all the hopes that Titus was going to take over the studio during these troubled times. And here is Titus. I wanted to show you this portrait of Titus because he's also writing and thinking, like the father's portrait of 1648. I already talked about this portrait from 1659 from the National Gallery of Art, 3 years after the bankruptcy, but I wanted you to see it again because you remember the unfinished hands versus very well finished face. And now that you've seen the Raphael and the Titian and the Castiglione, it's interesting to contemplate whether Rembrandt in this case is also not harking back to Raphael's portrait of the ultimate gentleman of the Renaissance. But instead of being dressed in this rich clothing, like in 1640, he's wearing very simple brown garb of the kind that a painter might wear when he goes out, but certainly not somebody rich. However, he retains the black felt cap. And that's the close-up of the face, just to show you once more how amazingly textured and thick that paint is, and how somebody like Lucian Freud must have learned from this. And